So welcome everyone to the August lecture in the focal topic Justice in Sustainability. My name is Bernardo Jurema and I'm part of the coordination team of the Justice in Sustainability focal topic at the Research Institute for Sustainability. This public lecture series is one of the activities carried out in the context of the RIF's 2022-23 focal topic. The public lecture series features different well-established and rising scholars and practitioners in the fields of justice and sustainability. Our aim is to put highly relevant work on different justice dimensions in climate and sustainability politics up for debate, addressing an academic audience as well as the general public. The dates for our upcoming activities can be found on our website. So please check our website. You can also subscribe to our newsletter, or you can follow us on Twitter if you want to learn more about our activities. I'm going to put all those links in the chat shortly. So today we're going to have a presentation with Fredrik Albritton Jonsson and Karl Wennerlind. They are going to talk about their book, Scarcity, A History from the Origins of Capitalism to the Climate Crisis, in which they explore the historical development of the concept of economic scarcity over 5 centuries of European thought and how it played a key role in fostering the climate crisis. So the authors point out how modern economics assumes humans have limitless desires, leading society to prioritize endless growth and consumption, regardless of environmental limits. Fredrik Albritton Jonsson and Karl Wennerlind reveal that this perspective on scarcity is relatively recent and was not a foregone conclusion, even during this capitalist era. They argue that it emerged as a costly victory for ideologies centered on perpetual growth, overshadowing traditions that advocated for living in harmony with nature's boundaries. Part of the struggle for climate justice requires that we in the global north come to terms with planetary boundaries and the ecological cost of our lifestyle. So in this book, both Fredrik and Karl, they offer key and original insights in that sense. So I will now turn to them, and after their presentation, we'll have a Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Bernardo, for the introduction, and thank you very much for having us today. And thanks also importantly to all of you who are tuning in this morning, afternoon in Germany, of course. So Fredrik and I are absolutely delighted to talk to you about the book and give you a short overview of the main arguments, and then happy to take your questions afterwards. This book is in many ways based on the assumption that one of the key aspects that needs to be undertaken in order to address climate change and biodiversity loss and environmental degradation is that we need a new way of assessing and thinking about the relationship between economy and nature. We've been thinking within the notion of neoclassical economic scarcity for almost 150 years, and this has been a very successful mindset and framework within which to generate as much economic growth as possible. But now that we stand at a moment where economic growth is the problem, not the solution, Fredrik and I are suggesting that a new way of thinking needs to be generated. So we're addressing this book to creative thinkers, younger thinkers, thinkers who are willing to think beyond the paradigms that have been inherited by now 3 generations of scholars. And we're hoping to inspire different models, different perspectives, and different philosophies as to the relationship between economy and nature. So we're not necessarily suggesting that economic growth has been exclusively a negative. And in fact, Karl Marx even suggested that capitalism has accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. This was, of course, in 1848. Imagine what he would have said about the wonders that have been created in places like Chicago, New York, Shanghai, and Berlin. And had he seen the real effects of the Great Acceleration. Now, the issue with economic growth is that it's an anomaly. It's a historically specific phase of history, and indeed, 99.9993% of the time that Homo sapiens has roamed the earth, there's have been nothing resembling sustained exponential economic growth. So there are, of course, many different explanations for where this economic growth comes from, but one explanatory factor is the mindset that humanity has embraced that enables and allows for and almost takes for granted after a certain point that economic growth is a fundamental human condition. So economists have been in the forefront in pushing this notion, and they do so on the basis of a number of assumptions. And the key one is that that essentially growth can continue in perpetuity. You might start to run out of resources, but that's not a problem for the economists because prices will go up, which will reduce demand, and the higher prices will also spark innovative ideas and scientific research that will substitute for the resources that are becoming scarce. All right? So economists like to think in terms of infinite substitutability. They also like to think in terms of fungibility, that all goods in the world are translatable or transformable into anything else through the market, not through alchemy, but through the market. And then finally, economists believe that humans, right, are insatiable. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, you always want more. And Carl Menger, one of the founders of neoclassical economics, suggested in the 1870s that one man may live in a palace, consume the choicest foods, and dress in the most costly garments. Another may find his resting place in the dark corner of a miserable hut, feed on leftovers, and cover himself with rags. But both of them face this perpetual condition of scarcity. So the neoclassical notion of scarcity, meaning that everyone is constantly experiencing the world as inadequate, as scarce, that is triggering two responses. One is that all resources needs to be maximized. They need to be utilized and exploited as much as possible. And the other, over time, is that you want to create as much economic growth as possible in order to alleviate the condition of scarcity. So scarcity, we argue, even though it's the kind of counterintuitive, or it's the opposite of growth, but we're arguing that because economists assume scarcity, they're always promoting economic growth as the solution to scarcity. So the problem is, of course, that this ideology, and we call it that, this ideology has been too successful in achieving its ends. So the Great Acceleration has given us the climate crisis, a biodiversity crisis, a resource exhaustion crisis, and an ocean acidification crisis. So we're running out of vital resources, species are being extinct at an alarming rate, and we have used up the Earth's CO2 sinks. Right? So by burning fossil fuel to generate energy to fuel the economic growth process, we're essentially destroying the planet. So we've now entered a new phase, which we call planetary scarcity. And as I said in the beginning, in the stage of planetary scarcity, growth is not a viable solution. Now, some people suggest that we can just trust genetic engineering, nanotechnology, AI, and geoengineering, but we think that this is too risky. We think that we need to start to build a different relationship between humanity and nature. And a key factor behind that, or in that process, is to rethink this relationship. And what we've done in this book is to highlight a number of different alternative ways of thinking about the economy-nature nexus, highlight a number of past forms of thinking about scarcity. And we're historicizing the notion of scarcity in order to kind of pierce the veil or destabilize what has become a very normalized and naturalized point of view. So we've developed, I think it's 11 different ideas of that has been represented in the past. Some of them are cornucopian ideas in the way that neoclassical economics is. The idea that nature is considered to be infinitely expandable, and our desires are also infinitely expandable. The other set or other umbrella term is finitarian scarcity. And this is the notion that nature is limited, it has boundaries, and also in order for societies to flourish in that kind of a world, desires in the economy are circumscribed either by religion or morality or politics. So what we offer in the book is a kind of longue durée smorgasbord, if you want, in which we offer or exemplify ways that people have thought about the relationship between economy and nature in the past, in order to kind of trigger thinking and trigger ideas in how we can develop alternatives to neoclassical economics and move beyond the obsession that we have with neoclassical economics, with economic growth. So let me just give you a little bit of a sense of these early notions of scarcity. So we begin the story in the 16th century with neo-Aristotelian scarcity. And here's an idea that's very much grounded in a Christian Aristotelian notion of a nature that's fixed and immovable. It's sparse, it's rugged, it's a punishment for original sin. It's very difficult to extract resources and to turn them into wealth. You're relying entirely on the photosynthesis and muscular power. And the idea is not to build knowledge for an infinite improvement in the future, but it's about making it through the cycle, whether it's the year, whether it's the season, whether it's the 7-year cycle. There's, of course, knowledge, but the knowledge that's passed down through generations. To match this kind of limitation of nature, society was conceived as a highly circumscribed organism. It was static, it was hierarchical, often depicted as a body politic where the king was the head. The vital organs represented the priesthood and the aristocracy. The arms represented the artisans, the legs, the peasants, and the circulatory system referred to the merchants. The idea here was that everyone had circumscribed needs and wants, and they were decided by the station in the body politic that someone occupied. So there's a great deal of mutual aid thinking, great deal of paternalism, and there's religion, law, custom designed to set limits on how much people wanted. In fact, just thinking about the 7 deadly sin, at least 5 of them had to do with limiting people's desires. So envy, pride, gluttony, greed, and lust, all of them were considered destructive. So moderation was the key word in this neo-Aristotelian worldview. So nature was circumscribed, desires in the economy were limited. So here you had a kind of a scarcity notion that was based on a harmonious balance between nature and the economy. Moving into the 16th century, we talk about Thomas More and his famous book Utopia, where he sort of mints what we call the idea of enclosure scarcity, this idea that money starts to become more and more important, and that triggers more and more greed and desires amongst the merchants in particular, and that they start to accumulate on a boundless level, dispossessing many of the peasants and the common people, generating a new situation of scarcity in which the rich want more always because they have an unlimited desire for more accumulation, and the poor wanted more always because they had nothing. So that creates a kind of an inequality model for scarcity. If we move forward another 100 years, we encounter Gerrard Winstanley, who thought in many ways similar to More, but had a different solution. For Winstanley, the creation of private property had essentially institutionalized greed and selfishness and handed the power of society to the greats, to the aristocracy, to the landowners, victimizing the general peasantry. And for him, the solution was to just eradicate private property and move back to strict adherence to what he called the inner love of God that was planted in every human chest. It's just that it had become muted. Thomas More, of course, offers a much more elaborate view of a post-scarcity, post-property society in which he discusses a world without individual wealth, without accumulation, without markets, profits, wealth disparities, economic classes, competition, no fashion, no money, no gold and silver, etc., etc. The idea was to have enough or just the right amount. So as we're entering the 17th century, there's a great deal of flux in the notion of scarcity. And now one of the biggest changes occurs, and that's the entry of Francis Bacon and the Hartlib Circle. This is a group of audacious reformers and improvers who, in the midst of the Little Ice Age, the 30 Years' War, and the English Civil War, launched a program for improvement. This program was millenarian in the sense that they believed in a kingdom of heaven on earth. It was alchemical in the sense that they believed that everything in nature was malleable and potentially transformable into something else. And it was Baconian in the sense that it was based on, based on the idea that knowledge provides power, and in this case, provides power over nature. So they argued, the Hartlib Circle, that is, that science, experimental science, empirical science, with a bit of alchemy thrown in, that it was possible to discover the unseen forces in nature. It was possible to figure out the causal mechanisms operating in this magnificent space created by God. And if you can figure out and understand the invisible particles and the invisible forces, you can use them for human betterment, right? And there's no real end to this. They constantly talked about infinite improvement and infinite expansion, and that God had given humanity an infinite treasure. The only problem or the only challenge was to figure out a way to unlock the source code, to figure out the source code to unlock nature. and then this kind of cornucopian world would be available to humanity. So they promoted collaborative research based on Bacon's idea of Solomon's house. The idea was to create kind of research campuses where scholars from all over the world bonded together and shared their knowledge. And this was knowledge that would be applicable to medicines, to surgical techniques, to new foods, to the transformation of animals. Nothing in nature was off limits to their voracious curiosity and commitment to turning nature into human wealth. Right? Now, with this new way of thinking about the world as unlimited and constantly expanding, the necessity of having a society that was bounded and desires that were bounded was no longer that important. So it became gradually more and more common for social theorists and philosophers to argue that the economy can expand infinitely with nature, and that desires should be unlocked, they should be unleashed, and so that they could serve as a kind of machine or the primary impetus behind this growth process. So one of them was Nicholas Barbon, who became not particularly famous during his lifetime, but became quite prominent later on as a theoretician. He was famous as a real estate broker and a banker and an insurance entrepreneur. But he would argue that desires were indeed infinite. There were wants of the body that were limited, but there were wants of the mind that were infinite. And this had to do with a kind of Veblen idea of consumption, meaning that it was not really the joy and the satisfaction of consumption per se, but it was kind of how your consumption was read in other people's eyes. So Barbon gives way for Bernard Mandeville, who of course is the most famous and scandalous of the Augustan philosopher, who proclaimed that essentially you just need to let go of the seven sins, and that will provide the solution and generate this kind of process of growth. So what you have then by the start of the 18th century is a new notion of scarcity, and this is a very formative notion, which argues or assumes that both nature and the economy can grow infinitely. So it's almost like a double helix of infinities, and at any given moment, wants are outstripping means. So you have a genuine scarcity condition, but it's one in which both of these entities are expanding infinitely. So just in closing, before I leave the baton to Fredrik, this idea of an infinite cornucopian scarcity, which is a bit of a mouthful, but so this idea gets, it gets perturbed in the beginning of the 18th century with the Mississippi and South Sea bubbles, and in the aftermath of that, people like Swift and Defoe who are depicted here started satirizing the basic assumptions of the cornucopian worldview. So they started making fun of science. They said, Swift, that is, suggested that he came in Gulliver's Travels, he's poking fun at Solomon's house. He came to this island in which there are 500 laboratories of scientists working to improve the human conditions, and they were busy trying to extract sunbeams out of cucumbers, building houses from the roof down, reducing human excrement to the original food, and feeding spiders dyes so that they could weave colorful textiles. They also satirized the kind of new bourgeois subject by comparing them to yahoos, which were these kind of disgusting creatures that were devouring everything in their way and who were obsessed with gold and sex. So this leads to a kind of reaction to the cornucopian worldview. And then the Enlightenment philosophers, Adam Smith and David Hume, try to pick up the story. And what they sought to do was to find a way to retain the basic assumptions of cornucopian scarcity, but they wanted to kind of curtail it. They wanted to moderate it and make it slightly more palatable and less scandalous. And I'm happy to talk more about that during the Q&A, but I think my time is out. So without further ado, here is Fredrik.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Really great pleasure to be with you. As Karl suggested, we are sketching in this book kind of a family tree of two rival kinds of scarcity, the cornucopian and the finitarian types. The dawn of the 19th century witnessed the emergence of several new kinds of finitarian forms of scarcity. Let me just adjust my screen here for 1 second. The full flourishing of the Industrial Revolution triggered three kinds of finitarian scarcity. The first one that we discuss in the book is the romantic notion of scarcity, which we argue amounted to a systematic rethinking of both human desire and the natural world. These poets and philosophers imagined a world in which people were motivated by beauty and community rather than consumption, and treated nature as the spiritual center of human life. What we call romantic scarcity embraced human restraint and material simplicity, respecting the finitude of the world, but also its transcendental value, right? So nature here as an object, not of material consumption, but spiritual reflection and absorption. Almost in the same moment, T.R. Malthus argued for a very different kind of finitarian scarcity. He saw the world in terms of population, geometrically growing population, and the finite supply of land, such that demographic growth would inevitably outstrip agricultural yield, since the latter could grow only at an arithmetic rate. As I'm sure most of you are aware, he posited what he called positive checks for population, disease, war, and famine that would cull the surplus population until, after much suffering, excess numbers could be brought down back into balance with a circumscribed natural world. So with Malthusian scarcity, just to repeat, we have a notion of a finite supply of land placing immovable physical limitations on human growth. And let me anticipate an argument I'll make in a moment. We, in positing a new kind of scarcity in our own moment, the scarcity that we call planetary scarcity, we are not arguing for a revival of Malthus. It's a distinctive condition that has the potential to revive Malthusian ideology, but actually its material and social characteristics are very different. The third and final version of finitarian scarcity to emerge in the 19th century comes with socialism. Karl Marx's radical critique of both the Enlightenment of Adam Smith and Malthus. Marx argued that scarcity was driven not by boundless desire for consumption, but rather by industrial capitalism and the capitalist's incessant pursuit of accumulation. Marx shifted blame for scarcity from humanity in general to a particular elite, which constantly sought to impose labor on the working classes, not primarily to enjoy the fruits thereof, but to reproduce its own dominance. And since the incessant force driving the capitalist as a class was the reproduction of command and control, we call this kind of scarcity capitalist scarcity. With other radicals, Marx envisioned an alternative future, one based on an entirely different relationship between nature and the economy, one that looked forward to a world in which technology would produce an abundance of material wealth to satisfy basic needs, while liberating us from capitalist domination, freeing people to pursue the full spectrum of human desire, human passions. Whereas Malthus identified the source of scarcity in the clash between the Earth's physical limits and the insatiability of collective human desire, Marx and his comrades imagined what we call socialist scarcity as the interplay between a needs-based economy and the scientifically driven mastery of nature. So in fact, there is a sense in which socialist scarcity actually has a Promethean but not cornucopian component, in as much as it assumes the mastery of nature through technology. All right. All of this, the emergence of Malthusian scarcity, of romantic scarcity, and socialist scarcity, happened against the backdrop of dramatic planetary processes. After the Little Ice Age, the 17th century crisis that saw the rise of cornucopian scarcity, the climate of the Northern Hemisphere grew more favorable during the Enlightenment and the 19th century. And this warm spell, in turn, coincided with wide-ranging adoption of fossil fuel, first in Britain and then across the West. A geological endowment stored up over millions of years enabled a quantum leap in energy use. But precisely this windfall disrupted the carbon cycle that controls the planetary climate. By unleashing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere on a scale not seen for millions of years, the new fossil fuel economy brought the Holocene to an end. Carbon, if you're just looking at carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, it's clear that this happened already by the end of the 19th century. So ironically, right at the moment that Marx theorized socialist scarcity, and marginalist economists launched their bid for neoclassical scarcity. Now, since we've already heard about the origins of neoclassical scarcity from the period at the very end of the 19th century, 1860 or so onward, I'll skip over that component and just move into the 20th century. After the end of World War II, the advanced economies of the world entered a period of unprecedented economic growth, powered by new technology, science-driven technology, cheap energy, fossil energy primarily, and mass consumption. Politicians and economists greeted this great acceleration with open arms. For most members of the economics profession, this sustained growth between 1950 and 1970 vindicated the basic optimism of their discipline about the truth and universality of neoclassical scarcity. Utility maximizing consumers and profit maximizing firms seem to have settled on an optimal resource allocation. Innovation, substitution, and efficiency seem capable of averting the threat of depletion in non-renewable resources. The new aggregate measure of gross domestic product made abstract growth easy to fathom and celebrate. In fact, in liberal democracies, as well as in the Soviet world, the holy grail of sustained growth became the foundation of politics. But at the same time, human impacts on the environment escalated, setting the planet on the path towards multiple tipping points. Historian John McNeill calls this double movement of economic growth and environmental degradation the Great Acceleration. In scientific terms, the concept captures the systemic and interrelated impacts of economic development on the biosphere that began around 1950 and are continuing into the present. It's closely connected to the framework of planetary boundaries put forward in 2009 by environmental scientists Johan Rockström and Will Steffen. Vital socioeconomic and environmental indicators show steep growth curves in world population, GDP, primary energy use, transportation, water use, and tropical forest loss. A dizzying rise in greenhouse gas marked the most ominous of all these changes. Atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide surpassed the Holocene pattern of natural variability. After World War II, carbon emissions multiplied from a global mean of 311 parts per million, 311 parts per million in 1950 to 417 in 2022. In the first decades of the Great Acceleration, emissions came principally from Europe and North America. And after 1980, China, India, and other economies in outside the West contributed increasing shares. And here we arrive at the final concept of scarcity in the book. The Great Acceleration provoked disquiet among environmental scientists. Ecologists sounded the alarm about man-made toxins. Climate scientists mapped out the disruption of the planetary carbon cycle. By the 1980s, the depletion of the ozone layer and the increase of greenhouse gases seemed to indicate that the biosphere was much closer to tipping points than earlier generations had imagined. So we get a new sense of planetary vulnerability, if you like. In 2000, Paul Crutzen and his colleague Eugene Stormer proposed that humanity had left the relatively stable and benign climate of the Holocene to enter a new dangerous epoch, which they named the Anthropocene. This concept of the Anthropocene presented a visceral challenge to the mental universe of neoclassical scarcity. Insatiable desire and endless economic growth seemed to be on a collision course with the Earth system itself. The political discovery of anthropogenic climate change pushed the discourse of natural limits in a new direction. From the age of Malthus, pessimists had worried about the physical limits to growth imposed by the finite supply of land and non-renewable mineral stock. Again, what we call Malthusian scarcity. But with global warming and biodiversity loss, the threat shifted from a problem of finite stock to a scarcity of sinks. Simply put, there was too much coal, petroleum, and natural gas in relation to the Earth system's capacity to absorb waste, the waste products of fossil fuel. The ancient symbol of infinite space, the boundless ocean and endless atmosphere, turned out to be all too finite. Post-war ecological thinkers like Rachel Carson and Kenneth Boulding anticipated the idea of planetary scarcity with warnings about oceanic and atmospheric pollution already in the 1960s. By the 1980s and 90s, Jim Hansen and the IPCC showed that planetary sinks were already in the process of filling up. In his 2016 essay, The Great Derangement, the Indian novelist and social critic Amitav Ghosh argues that the rise of industrial economies in the global south exposes the cruel truth about the fossil fuel development by driving up worldwide demand for energy and resources, while at the same time increasing the amount of waste in the system. Globalization threatens to push the planet closer, ever closer to calamitous degradation. Ghosh's paradox captures an essential relation, something essential about the relation between neoclassical and planetary scarcity. The more the developing nations seek to emulate the fossil path of the global north, the greater the disruption to the carbon cycle. As emissions mount, it becomes evident that the original promise of the Great Acceleration cannot be universalized. where neoclassical scarcity sees history as a confluence of insatiable, ever-expanding desire and fossil-fueled progress, planetary scarcity reveals the limits of human ingenuity, the dangers of unintended consequences, and the fragility of earthly things. This leaves us with the possibility of new openings, new ways for the social and economic imagination to see the world. And here we would like to propose a new protagonist in our part of world history, phytoplankton. In the upper layers of Earth's oceans, single-cell organisms, collectively known as phytoplankton, thrive in great numbers, drifting along the currents. Although microscopic in size, they add up to an aggregate biological force that shapes the conditions of life on the planet to an extraordinary degree. And as you probably know, decomposing phytoplankton from the deep past have yielded a crucial ingredient in shale and petroleum formation, and therefore, ironically, a major portion of fossil fuel consumption in the present. But in our own moment, they are also, of course, living phytoplankton are converters of solar energy into organic materials. So they have a central place in the food chains of the sea. By transforming carbon dioxide and water into oxygen and carbohydrates through photosynthesis, phytoplankton offer a sink for human pollution, while at the same time making the atmosphere breathable. They absorb upwards of 45 to 50 gigatons of inorganic carbon each year. They produce half of the oxygen in the atmosphere. Even though they comprise less than 1% of the biomass on the planet, phytoplankton are thus as important to the Earth system and the carbon cycle as terrestrial sinks like the rainforests. The science of phytoplankton is a belated achievement. Only recently have scientists begun to grasp the significance of these organisms for the Earth system. During millennia, humans have ignored the life of the oceans, imagining the sea as infinite and impervious to human influence. Now, we're beginning to appreciate just how vulnerable marine ecosystems are and how much they do to keep the world habitable. The capitalist economy has brought about rapid and massive changes that threaten to overwhelm the oceans. The science of phytoplankton resembles in this regard the discovery of anthropogenic climate change. Both reveal critical material boundaries for human flourishing, and both suggest how little we know about the natural world, how dangerous the current worldview has been for the stable functioning of the Earth system. So this is where we end our book. We end with a plea that rather than press ahead with technical fixes and further exploitation, it would be wiser to slow down, to repair the damage we've done, to back off, to preserve ecosystems like phytoplankton from further disturbances. So to sum up, we argue that we have entered a new condition, which we call a condition of planetary scarcity, and it's a physical condition of overfilling sinks, but in cultural and political terms, it's still up for grabs, in as much as we don't see yet a dominant new ideology take command to transform and reorient economies and societies to recognize this material condition. So we end our book with a series of really speculative queries about the shape of things to come. We think we need to slow down the great acceleration. We argue that this slowing down, this de-acceleration, will require immense creativity in cultural and social terms. We are not arguing simply for withdrawal alone. Restraint and withdrawal will not suffice. we face dangers so extensive that technological transformation and cultural change are necessary. To back off, we first need to repair what has been damaged. So we're not promoting technophobia, we're not Luddites, we're not apocalyptic in our pessimism. We argue instead that our best bet is to purge older forms of mechanistic and dualistic cornucopianism from our politics, our culture, our way of knowing the world, in favor of a new politics and technology and economics of repair, oriented towards universal flourishing within planetary constraints. And one can imagine many different pathways towards this condition. We don't suggest that we'll settle easily on one single path. In fact, the book is framed as a pluralistic account of the alternatives before us. We're running out of time to decarbonize, to preserve biodiversity, and it's doubtful that we can come together politically as a single movement in the time that's left. Much more likely is that we'll have to come together somehow around a shared responsibility, but from very different viewpoints. So this explains why we're so interested in examining the storehouse of the past. We think that many of these ideas of scarcity that we described, particularly the finitarian notions of scarcity, of course, might come into play. And indeed, it's pretty clear that they already are. I'll give you just 3 examples of this. We have a major revival of Marxism under an ecological guise, with thinkers like Jason Moore and Andreas Malm and others. We also have a romantic or quasi-romantic approach in the degrowth movement. Think of Bill McKibben's celebration of local community, of slow growth or degrowth. And then thirdly, not to forget, within religious circles, there are some very important examples of bringing traditional religious cosmologies to bear on the planetary crisis. For example, Pope Francis' encyclical Laudato Si. Now, without a doubt, the ethos of repair that we are promoting will require a profound psychological shift across the planet. Cornucopian ideology has usurped the universal aspirations of equality, freedom, and creative fulfillment posited by the Enlightenment. Any viable alternative to the present order needs to come to terms with a human desire for self-determination, but find means to channel it in new directions. Repair does not rule out an element of dynamism. Sustainable economies can still foster individual and collective forms of creativity, pleasure, and play, channeled through science and art, as well as everyday living. But whatever direction freedom takes in the great deceleration, human desire will be bounded by the new condition of planetary scarcity. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Fredrik and Karl, for this extremely insightful, thought-provoking presentation. So now we will open to the Q&A session, where I invite our audience members to raise their virtual hands if they want to ask any questions. And before we do that, I just like to ask you, Fredrik or Karl or both, because of the topic of our lecture series, I was interested in what are the justice implications of this, what I'm calling coming to terms with these planetary boundaries that you propose. And also, and before that, also, to what extent the creation or the construction, or I don't know what the exact term would be here, of the current notion of scarcity, how how just was it to begin with, or was it a response to democratic demands in the 19th century? Or so I would like to understand a little bit, if you could tell us the context from the justice dimension of this concept, and why it's important to come to terms with the planet boundaries, as you put it. So yeah, I hope the question makes sense.
Karl, shall I get us started?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, all right. Well, thanks again for listening to our talk, and we're looking forward very much to your questions. Thank you, Bernardo, for that excellent question about justice. Well, simply put, in the best of possible futures, we hope what would happen would be a convergence around some new universal ideal of minimum guidelines for development within planetary boundaries. And probably the only way that could really happen under the banner of justice would be through degrowth in the global north, and limited growth based on renewable energy and forms of land use that preserve a maximum of biodiversity in the global south. It's a very tall order. Like I said, we're not prophets. All we can do is gesture towards some likely paths. It may be that decarbonization could happen under much more tragic circumstances, where we do achieve decarbonization, but without this goal of justice getting fulfilled. That's perhaps a more likely outcome, sadly. And again, I think it's very, very important to keep in mind the closing window for decarbonization and other radical transformation. And this is, again, a reason why we adhere to this pluralist conception of convergence, right? It seems entirely unlikely that the world will be joined together in a single political movement at this point, within the next generation at the very least. Yeah. Karl,
let me just add something very brief to that. The question that you're asking, and what Fredrik is already offering as a solution, is of course absolutely essential to the kind of thinking and policy making on a global basis that needs to happen. But again, let me just say that neoclassical economics is not a particularly useful framework for that, nor is the cornucopium framework from the 17th century very useful in that sense. Both of these ideas are universalist in nature. They don't really take cultural, developmental, regional differences into mind. Neoclassical economics, for example, thinks of itself as not making these kind of judgments and not comparing utilities or satisfaction and well-being between different populations around the globe. And instead, it's a framework in which you think about everyone's freedom to convey their desires through the market. Now, the key here is, of course, that you only have a vote in the economic market if you have dollar bills to back it. And that means that even solutions within a market-driven framework is kind of tainted by the great deal of global inequality that I don't see neoclassical economics being able to think itself out of.
Thank you. So now, yeah, let's invite our members from the audience. Manuel, please.
Yes, hello. You can hear me, right? Yeah, okay. Hello, Fredrik and Karl. Fredrik, we've met here 8 years ago. You were at the conference where you talked about Victorian England and how geologists would perceive or not perceive or imagine coal scarcity. I've actually I'm a sociologist working here at the RIFS. I have two questions regarding the history of ideas you presented, but I will ask only one first in order to monopolize the discussion. The one question I have regards Marx, and you said that his was a Promethean but not cornucopian approach. I wonder what you meant by that with regard to his view of science, because in my perception, he did follow the Baconian program of a nature that's probably what you mean by Promethean, that would have need to be like overcome through technology and productive forces that like extract the maximum out of it. The only difference was, of course, that his view of the social was very different, and that he kind of I don't know. He kind of accused capitalists to like taking a share that they did not merit, and so they would create this artificial scarcity, so to say, that was because of a certain model of social hierarchy and wealth distribution and ownership. But is there a difference you see in how he treats science and scientific and technological relation between humans and nature? And if so, which is it? I mean, there could be something in the early manuscripts, the philosophical economic manuscripts that you refer to that I'm not aware of. So I was curious about that.
I can start that, Fredrik.
Right.
So the way that we read Marx is that, as you correctly point out, he's very much enthusiastic about technological change and gradual and infinite technological improvement. But it has to be done with a different intent in mind. He argues, and this is an argument that Andreas Malm has picked up on as well, he argues that much of technology in the 19th century was designed by the bourgeoisie as a means towards restoring the particular class composition that is conducive to a small minority controlling a vast majority. So that technology is not necessarily to generate, infinite expansion. It's about recreating the particular social conditions for accumulation. And accumulation was, the accumulation of capital, but capital for him was a social relationship. It was not a mass of things. And that social relationship is one of class domination. So the way that he saw the possibility of a socialist scarcity was one in which the intent behind technological improvement was no longer about domination, but it was about actually producing the kind of goods that satisfied needs. He argued that at the moment he was writing, that technological innovations had very little to do with satisfying the needs of the general population. Yes, the goods had to be realized, they had to be sold, so there had to be a market for it, but fundamentally, his focus was on the sphere of production. So in order to move beyond that kind of destructive use of technology, you needed to rearrange the social conditions of society and change who is in charge of the use of technology. So there needs to be a Promethean belief in technology to improve the human lot, but there needs to be constraints and restraints on the desires undergirding the process, and they need to move from the infinite quest for domination to a kind of genuine, authentic set of needs fulfillment for the general population.
I'll just add very briefly to that. Thank you. It's good to see you again, Manuel, and thanks for that excellent question. Yeah, very briefly, many of you will be aware of Kohei Saito's detective work in the notebooks of Marx. John Bellamy Foster's very interesting readings of Marx. There is, I think, among ecological Marxists, this desire to discover in Marx a green thinker, an ecological Marx. I'm not convinced myself. I mean, even if Kohei Saito is correct that Marx's mind turned towards the natural sciences and that he read deeply about climate change and soil chemistry already in the late 1850s and early 1860s, very little of that made its way into a social theory. Why is that? Well, I think Karl just answered that question for us. There was, if Marx had lived longer, if he had published more, maybe there would have been a new decisive stage, a step towards ecology. But I have my doubts about that for the simple reason that Marx is so vehemently opposed, so critical of Malthusian scarcity and romantic scarcity that I think that blocked the possibility of imagining nature differently, of thinking through the problem of limits and thinking through the value of nature in its own right.
Thank you, Fredrik. Thank you, Karl. Thank you, Manuel. Do we have anyone any other questions from the audience? Manuel has another question. Okay, let's go.
Yeah, I wanted to wait if somebody else has it, but if not, then I can skip it. The second question refers, actually, you said Malthusianism. Fredrik, refers to possible shades and the prospects of neo-Malthusianism. You can, in the beginning of your talk, Karl, you said that you were, of course, not propagating any neo-Malthusianism. Now, when you mentioned the possible revivals of finitarian scarcity models, you mentioned religion, which kind of bears in some of its expressions relations to birth control. No, they're against birth control, actually. But my question is whether in your review of contemporary revivals and actualizations of finitarian scarcity ideas, you came across or not with shades or approaches to ecofascism, because that's something that I would think first when I think of neo-Malthusianism. I mean, there's, for instance, a book by a German writer, Karl Marx, from the 90s. I don't know whether it has been translated into English, where he says that it's called Hitler as precursor, where he speculates that this heavy anti-egalitarianism that is in Hitler's Mein Kampf, against, like, saying, okay, we cannot provide, nature is not forgiving. This is something that Hitler says, actually, in Mein Kampf. Nature is merciless, and egalitarianism, which the Jews have, of course, invented, according to him, will kill us. So we need to decide who benefits from this the scarce whatever room and land and so we have, and who not. And I wonder whether you came across from the recent decades with ideas that pick up this dark side of Malthusianism, because in the mainstream sustainability debate, of course, it's a taboo. Population politics and something, these things are rarely touched upon. But I wonder whether you found some examples that speak to that.
Yeah, I'll start, Karl, and then you can add whatever you think I might have missed. So first of all, as I said earlier, we define planetary scarcity in contrast with Malthusian scarcity. So let me just reiterate. Planetary scarcity, in our argument, is the condition caused by the overconsumption of a minority of the world's population, which results in not a finitude of stock, but a finitude of sinks. right? Now, admittedly, biodiversity, how we define, one could actually define biodiversity in terms of stock, I think, but if we keep the definition simple and just focus on overconsumption of a minority of population resulting in waste flowing and overfilling sinks, we get a kind of minimalist picture. Now, it seems very, very clear that the planetary emergency will bring about not just new revitalized calls for justice, but also authoritarian forms of mobilization. Just in the presidential debate here in the United States last week, one of the candidates mentioned overpopulation in Mexico, overpopulation of non-white people as a threat. So even among the climate-denying Republican presidential candidates, there is this, I think, a neo-Malthusian option is already emerging, and surely it will only get more and more powerful as streams of refugees, mount. We don't tackle, because the book is primarily a history of ideas, we don't tackle policy. We don't tackle politics maybe as much as we should. Each chapter is centered on 3 to 4 major thinkers. In the chapter on the post-war era, the Great Acceleration and the emergence of planetary scarcity, the best representative we have of what you call ecofascism is Heidegger. So we do have, and we group him together with Hannah Arendt, who of course has a lot of bad baggage as well as a thinker. I'm thinking particularly of her notions of race, her idea of Africa. But we see them as grappling with the inheritance of romantic scarcity, while also confronting this new idea of planetary scarcity. But on a more positive note, we then moved to discuss Rachel Carson and Kenneth Boulding as key figures in the 1960s awakening, the ecological awakening. To the best of my knowledge, I don't think there's anything fascist about Carson's thought. I suppose Boulding could be defined in some ways as a neo-Malthusian. There's certainly a neo-Malthusian current in ecological economics. But whether we define that itself as ecofascism, I don't think it necessarily has to go in that direction. To put it differently, romantic scarcity for us can take both liberal and illiberal guises. So it's at the same time the source of, say, Bill McKibben's idea of degrowth, but also Martin Heidegger's conservative notion of the Heimat. Karl, did you want to add anything?
Nope, that was great, Fredrik.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Do you have any other questions from the audience? You can write down in the comments section, or you can in the chat, or you can raise your hands. Nice. Barbara, please.
Thanks, Bernardo. So I dare to ask a question. Thank you first for the really interesting thoughts and presentation you've given. I'm a geographer at RIFS, and I work on ocean governance and also questions of carbon dioxide removal and what kind of more encompassing way of regulating and organizing such technologies we might find. And there I have come across in discussion rounds, across arguments saying to fix the ocean, which is heavily damaged by climate change, we must go forward with such technologies. And then we're not necessarily thinking about increasing carbon dioxide, things like mangroves, but putting stuff in the ocean that is meant to alter ocean chemistry for ocean alkalinity enhancement, for example, with, I mean, still unknown effects, and possibly also effects that do not stay at that spot where the material is put in the ocean, but it could have long distance effects, it could have long-term effects. So there's a bit of uncertainty also related to that. There's uncertainty related also to what kind of climate fix can we actually achieve, will it last, etc., etc. And since you've taken the ocean as one of the examples that you work on, I would like to hear your perspective on these thoughts, also because you said, like, let's, take a step back, don't think so much about technology fixes, but make sure that we can save what I would call like our basic foundation. It's we live from water, earth, from everything that the earth can provide for us. So yeah, I just was curious what your thoughts are on such arguments. Thank you.
Sure, Fredrik.
Okay. Thank you so much, Barbara. That's an excellent question. Now, I should underscore, neither Karl nor I are oceanographers or experts in phytoplankton. So there's certainly a limit to how much I can say specifically about the problems you raise. But at the general level, it seems clear to me that we face a paradoxical condition. The planetary scarcity is paradoxical in that we have already, we may already have set off tipping points. We are at a very critical moment. And it's clear that decarbonization, if we just take that problem, will require massive transformation of economies and technologies around the world. Of course, more so in the global north that is so addicted to fossil fuel. So the only path forward is through big projects, right? We admit that. In that sense, I mean, there may be room for degrowth and local community as well. But to transform the grid in Europe and North America, these are massive undertakings. So in that sense, I think we have to intervene and be bold. The big question is, how do we preserve biodiversity? How do we stabilize biomes? Probably much depends on how critical the situation becomes. I mean, lots of people are now beginning to say that geoengineering can buy us time. We've been very slow at getting at the problem of decarbonization, but if we resort to geoengineering for a limited amount of time, we can extend the period of transition, and then draw down not just carbon emissions, but also eventually end the geoengineering program when we have stabilized the condition. But of course, that comes with its own set of massive risks, unintended consequences for the whole planet, and in my mind, a nightmarish moral hazard, right? Because the moment we begin geoengineering, this is an invitation to continue with business as usual for the fossil interests. And it's not a coincidence that many of the great players in the oil industry are now beginning to promote geoengineering. So I think much depends on the timing of how dangerous the situation gets. But unfortunately, the more dangerous, the greater the incentive to, shall we say, risky technological intervention and further unintended consequences. I want to be optimistic that there are still pathways that will ensure a benign outcome, but we have to be realistic. As for the oceans, again, I'm not an expert. The point of the phytoplankton as a protagonist in our story is to remind the reader that we are tampering with natural systems of which we know very little, right? So economics is based on benign unintended consequences. Ecology and earth system science, I think, warn us that actually malign unintended consequences are rife, from the ozone layer to acidification today. And so taking a precautionary and more conservative approach that leaves that eventually alleviates pressure on the biosphere, I think is absolutely critical, right? I mean, one way of putting it is we need a permanent ban on fossil fuel use, indefinitely, respected by all countries. We need a treaty on that. And we may also need some kind of international treaty on dangerous technologies, right? And the risks of unintended consequences. So again, it's a very tall order. Yeah, I hope that was at least a little bit of an answer to your question. Thank you, Barbara.
And let me just add to that, and let me go back to the quote by the Nobel Prize winning economist Bob Solow that we listed in the beginning. And he said in 1974, the world can, in effect, get along without natural resources. So exhaustion is just an event, not a catastrophe. And also, if we add Nordhaus, another Nobel Prize winning, actually the student of Bob Solow, who is promoting economic growth as such an important end and goal that he's comfortable with increases in temperatures of up to 3.5 degrees Celsius. As long as we stick with that fundamental framework for policymaking, as long as we stick with that fundamental framework for educating people in Econ 101 across the world, it's going to be very difficult to address the cause of what has brought us to this moment. So whatever we do in terms of fixes, it's not going to be enough unless we change the fundamental approach that we've had for the last 150 years. It brought a lot of good, and now the feast is over, and we need to recognize that and build that into our basic thinking.
Thank you, Karl. Thank you, Fredrik. If we don't have another question, I have one question. One question that I have is how does our understanding of this notion of scarcity that you offer in the book, how does it help inform how we can act as social actors in the struggle for decarbonization and for climate justice? How does that take place exactly?
Shall I
Sure.
start out? Yeah. We have, in some sense, we have a very specific audience in mind. I mean, the book is written for a broad audience, anyone interested in questions of sustainability. But if we could have a perfect reader, it would be an undergraduate in economics who's setting out, probably has in mind starting a career in economics or finance, and who has an open mind and has critical ideas and realizes the planet is in a bad state. So before they are entrapped in the gilded trap of neoclassical scarcity, before that happens, we would open their mind to this other world, right? By showing historical examples, by showing alternative futures where neoclassical scarcity is not the natural, not the universal way to think about the world. And we have some examples at the end of the book of alternative heterodox economics, not just Kenneth Boulding and Herman Daly, but also more recent heterodox economic thinking, like Partha Dasgupta's pioneering work on biodiversity, and Karen Raworth, donut economics. And of course, one could understand the Stockholm Resilience Center and Johan Rockström's work as partly addressing economics, trying to replace neoclassical scarcity notions with a new way of thinking economically, one where we bring together ecological knowledge with economic knowledge and try to make them fit together. So it's not exactly a program of action, but yeah, Karl, would you say that's maybe the specific aim we have in mind?
Yeah, I mean, I would just, we're both Fredrik and I are fundamentally intellectual historians, so we really do believe in the power of ideas. We really do believe that, activism is something that grows out of new thinking, and the new thinking needs to get become a kind of broad billow that infuses a new perspective into lots of people all around the globe. And given that neoclassical economics is so dominant, such a hegemonic framework within which to think, it's a real uphill battle, because the economists have almost kind of monopolized truth. And what they say is in some ways taken as dogma. And it's really difficult to kind of punch your way through that wall. We see in our students a real willingness to think differently. And many of our students are much more radical than we are, especially in terms of wanting to be action-oriented, and a lot of them are doing amazing things once they leave our respective institutions, and I'm sure that's true amongst young students across the globes. So we're really hoping that this book will ignite some people to think differently, but also to support the ones who are already moving in that direction, and that our book can be a bit of a tool and something that young students can use to increase their confidence that transcending this dogma is possible. Right. So I think ideas are crucial in this, as of course activism and changing technologies. The crisis is so dire that there needs to be changes in all levels of society. But that's a great question. Thanks, Bernardo.
No, thank you. I think that's a great place to leave it. I thank you. I thank once again our guests, Fredrik Albritton Jonsson, who is an associate professor of history and conceptual and historical studies in science at the University of Chicago, and Karl Wennerlind, who is a professor of history at Barnard College in at Columbia University. Thank you again for talking to us. I encourage everyone to go to their local book shop and order the book there. And thank you so much for taking part of our lecture series and for this important contribution to our ongoing conversation about justice in sustainability. I thank everyone for joining us. And please look on our website for information on how to sign up and subscribe to our newsletter and follow us on Twitter and everything. Our September Justice in Sustainability lecture will be with Nino Jordan. He is a Klaus Topfer Sustainability Fellow here at RIFS, and he will talk about carbon footprint Policies and Climate Justice, Inescapable Dilemmas. It will be on September 11th, so in a couple of weeks, and you can find all this information online in the links that I have sent on the chat. Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you again, Fredrik and Karl.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thanks.